What's going on with the government taking stakes in major tech companies? Crony capitalism? Fascism? What's happening? Let's check that out. Hey, this is James Gorey with the BAM Republican podcast. Welcome. Thanks for joining us. Yeah, so what's going on? Trump is taking 10% of Intel, 15% of the revenues from NVIDIA and AMD for their sales to China. What's going on? Well, okay, let's break this down. A lot's going on, actually. First, let's take Intel. Intel's a struggling chip maker. And at the same time, the CHIPS Act coming out of the Biden administration gave them billions of dollars, just a grant, really, for competitiveness and so forth. So that was with the prior administration. But at the same time, Trump is taking that grant and turning it into an equity position, a 10% equity position to be exact, for the federal government. And in return, in terms of AMD and NVIDIA, in return for their ability to sell stocks to or to operate in China, Trump is taking a 15% of their cut. Now 15% for the big guy, as it were. Sounds familiar? Kind of does. So look, let me get this out front. I voted for Trump. I support Trump. I realize there really isn't a viable alternative to Trump right now. There's no Democrat that I would consider voting for. I don't know what J.D. Vance is about that much. I just don't know much about him. You don't hear much about him. And what you do is pretty much down the line, right? Towing the line with Trump. So what Trump is doing is, it can be looked at a number of different ways. Crony capitalism, state capitalism, which is another word for kind of fascism. And this isn't the first time this has happened. The federal government has taken stakes or otherwise controlled or taken over private or semi-private organizations and enterprises before. The Roosevelt administration took over the Tennessee Valley Authority, which was a ongoing project to build a hydroelectric dam and supply power to the Tennessee Valley. It was doing fine, but the administration needed a win, needed something really big to show, so they took over the TVA and said, hey, this is what we're doing. Look what a good job we're doing. So they took an existing state enterprise and made it into a federalized enterprise. At the same time, Roosevelt, one of his first acts was the Gold Act. The Gold Seizure Act should have been called, because what he did was outlaw the holding of gold and mandated that everybody turn their gold in to be collected by the federal government and get paid, I don't know, $17 an ounce or whatever it was at the time. And then he turned around and under penalty of prison, so he compelled people, he took their private property, took their money, underpaid them for it, and then turned around and made like the gold price of per ounce like $35 or something. So it just doubled his money. So state overreach has happened before. This isn't the first time. Then, of course, you have Roosevelt interning the Japanese citizens during World War II. I don't know how many it was, but it was a lot. So that was unconstitutional on its face. But if we go further back, Lincoln suspended habeas corpus. There was the anti-sedition laws of 1798, I think it was. So there are instances where the state, the federal government, has taken liberties with the private sector, with individual people's right to hold gold, for example, or a state's right to conduct its Tennessee Valley hydroelectric dam the way it wanted to, or whatever it might be. So there's different examples of it through time. This doesn't mean that it's a prelude to fascism. And if we back out Trump and just go up to 2024, there was plenty of state collusion, state picking winners and losers under the Biden administration, certainly under the Obama administration. All those green companies, they all went bankrupt. Somebody made a lot of money out of those. I don't think success of the company was the goal. I think it was the funding of the company through federal dollars, which allowed the pass-through of some of that funding into people's bank accounts. But the bottom line is that there has been a long history of excess, of federal excess, taking over companies, taking apart of companies, directing companies' directions in terms of what they produce. I believe American car companies were forced to produce electric cars for a while. That may still be in effect. I'm not sure, but it's top of head thing. But so that's where we are. So we go before the Trump administration took place. The Biden administration, plenty of that. Now, in another direction, that same kind of effect, if we look at all the federal employees, high-level federal employees, communications directors, administration officials in the Trump, or no, excuse me, in the Biden and in the Obama administration, same people are married to people in the media, way up there. Okay, so Ben Rhodes and I forget his brother, I forget his name, but I'm just thinking things off the top of my head. There's been plenty of intermarriage between the media and the federal government, between the federal government and Wall Street, between the federal government and China, and state enterprises. So plenty of that going on, not to mention the fact that the federal government, members of the federal government like Pelosi and others have made fortunes in the stock market. They're picking winners and losers. They know what's going to happen. They make the laws, and they're profiting off the laws in the stock market with insider information. And that, too, is a blending and melding of the federal government with private or even public enterprises that aren't federally owned. So lots of that going on. So with Trump saying, look, instead of giving Intel an $8 billion grant, why don't we get something for our money? I get that. I understand that. I think everybody does on that level. Same thing, if you're going to sell it to China, you got to pay a premium. You got to give us a cut, a 15% cut. So on the one hand, it's let's stop giving money to these corporations. Let's get a return on the investment. To what amount or direction the federal government has a say in what these companies produce and how they produce it, who they sell it to, there's going to be some of that as well, undoubtedly. But I understand Trump's motivation and his rationalization to get something out of these grants. The problem is, going forward, it's been the same problem before Trump got there, and that is you have tremendous amounts of corruption. You have the best politicians that money can buy because they're being funded through political decision-making. And political decision makers almost invariably want to get compensated for their enabling of federal dollars to flow into an industry. And that's what lobbyists are all about. That's what special interests are all about. That's what political action committees are all about. All of those things. So on the one hand, let's see what Trump is doing and call it what it is. He's saying, look, let's get some kind of payback, some kind of return off of these federal dollars that we're investing in these huge tech companies. But on the flip side, we're also seeing tremendous amounts of, it's a bad optics, right? Tremendous amounts of criticism, rightly so, that this kind of flirts with a fascistic overall idea of government and big business colluding at the expense of the rest of the country. Now, there's another example that goes way back to the Obama administration, at least, and that was Facebook. Facebook colluded, and certainly during the 2020 and certainly during COVID, they colluded. Facebook did, Twitter did at the time, these social media companies, blatant and comprehensive collusion with the federal government to silence critics, silence people with a different opinion, silence people who brought up evidence that one treatment or another for some kind of disease was bad. Even if those people were highly accomplished, well-placed vice presidents of said companies, former vice presidents even, that came forward and said, this is wrong, this is bad, these medications, these medicines, these massive recommendations that are going through, they were silenced. I'm talking about hundreds, if not thousands, of medical professionals, scientists around the world. They were silenced in coordination with the federal government. So let's pull back a little bit and see what Trump is doing. So without taking a stake in Intel, would they still be getting the $8 billion from the CHIPS fund? Yes, they would. Would NVIDIA and AMD still be selling to China? Probably. So that part hasn't changed. The danger I see, as anyone sees, and the left is partially right on this, but partially really disingenuous, is that where does this end up? What happens when we get an Obama back in office and says we want to control the economy, which they tried to do, and did so to a large extent, to a much more extent than I'm comfortable with. So I don't like the federal government picking winners and losers and taking equity positions. I just don't like that. I don't like them rounding up citizens, and I'm going to go into that on the next talk a little bit about deciding on who gets to stay and who gets to leave, almost arbitrarily. I'm going to go into that again in another talk after this one. But in terms of business ownership, does federal ownership really help? I'm going to argue that it doesn't. And I'm going to argue that I would say that there's got to be a sunset provision. In other words, there has to be an ending. You can't have unending ownership. You could. It's not a good idea to have unending federal ownership in companies. That distorts the market. If a company is going to fail, it needs to fail. If banks need to fail, they should be allowed to fail. What happens when banks fail? Prices crash, and then they hit bottom, and then they recover, and the practices that drove those banks to failures are outlawed or eliminated. You just can't afford to do them. So there's that angle to it. But there's also the angle that it's bad for business. It's bad. It's too tempting for corrupt politicians to take advantage of. And there's also the fact that could that money be better spent elsewhere? So on the one hand, Trump's trying to drive revenue. They already have the money. Let's get some of it back and put it into our coffers. They're already doing business with China. Let's charge them a 15% surcharge for doing so. So I get that. Let's get revenue coming into the country, coming into the coffers, coming into the treasury, trying to knock down that debt, which is a debt bomb, by the way. In fact, that's the same motivation is why Trump is hammering Powell so hard at the Fed. He wants the rates dropped. The housing industry, as we all know, or we should know, if we recall the 2008-2009 crisis, the housing industry affects pretty damn well much everything. Close enough. And the reality is that when people can't buy houses, all the surrounding economics suffer. Gardeners, painters, Home Depot stores, furniture stores, whatever it may be, right? Home decorator stores, Halloween, you got no house to decorate. Everything suffers. The tax base suffers, okay? Neighborhoods suffer. A neighborhood of renters is much less desirable typically than a neighborhood of owners. That's just how things are. Because when you own something, more often than not, you care about how it looks and you take care of it and so forth. So all of that, and the result of that is corporate ownership. So now we have corporate ownership from Wall Street of about 25%, 20-25% of the houses in the US. That's a bad thing. Not a good thing whatsoever. So I think my suggestion, one of them would be, look, let's have a sunset clause on this kind of law, on this kind of legislation, that you can't hold it for longer than a certain time, say 5 years, subject to renewal, and that renewal has to be vigorously demonstrated in terms of need and in terms of integrity. So I would sunset these things for 5 years, maybe 3 years. Make it very short term. And as far as corporate ownership in Wall Street, which again benefit from the largesse and the generosity of the American people and the Federal Reserve, they got bailed out. What are they doing with the money? They're buying our homes. They're making us rent from them to a large extent. Not me, but many, many people. So that needs to be addressed. It's all under the same umbrella in terms of the powers that be, the federal government, Wall Street, which are inextricably linked. Wall Street, federal government, banking, they're all under the same umbrella to a large extent. And the fact that they are taking stakes in companies, they're taking stakes in housing, which is the backbone of American, the American economy and the American culture, homeownership, is the greatest source of generational transfer of wealth. If you take that away, you're effectively, and purposely in my mind, disenfranchising and impoverishing the next generation. So that ought not to be. And it's the same reasoning. So if Trump's going to do that, which he is, there needs to be a sunset clause. And there needs to be demonstrable need, demonstrable benefit, not just need, but benefit. Benefit to who? Benefit to the economy, not to the company. That goes without saying. It's got to be benefit to the country, benefit to the competitors. And that's another thing. It kind of wipes out competitiveness. In other words, nobody wants to say, well, we invested $8 billion in Intel and they still failed, so now I look bad for doing that. No, you want to make sure that they succeed. So there's that temptation of creating fictional revenue, fictional success for political purposes. So I don't like what's going on. I know it's not brand new. It's been going on for decades and generations. It's been going on in the media. It's been going on in Wall Street. It's been going on in high tech, certainly in the automakers and other large business areas. But it ought to be limited. There ought to be stringent guidelines and restrictions on how long, and so forth. That's my take on that. And again, the big worry is that you get a continuation rather of this policy going forward. So it becomes normalized rather than a 1 or 2 off or 3 off or something. Now I realize, again, it's more prevalent than we realize, than is really made known. But that needs to change, and the priority of the government needs to change. The priority of the government needs to be the health of the American economy and jobs. And when you subsidize something, you often subsidize failure. Because if they didn't need the subsidize, that means they were successful. And if they need the subsidization, that means they haven't been successful, they made wrong decisions. So in a sense, you're propping up failure in a real sense. And maybe it would have been smarter for Intel to break up into different companies based on division and get leaner, meaner, and more innovative in each one of those verticals. GE could probably benefit from the same thing. So that's my thought. It's flirting with fascism. We've been flirting with fascism for a long time. It is a reality of the overlap and the interrelatedness and the interaction between government, banking, industry, finance. That's all interrelated. But I don't like the direction things are going, and there needs to be some oversight, some regulatory guidance and restrictions on the terms, how long, metrics, and other things. So that's my thought. If you like this kind of content, this kind of analysis, please subscribe to the Banana Republican channel. Make some comments, see if I'm right or wrong, and share and like. And all right, we'll see you next time.